Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion on astrology, art, and adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore the current planetary alignments and offer insights for coping with change. Educational, informative, enlightening, the Turning of the Wheel is a welcome pause in your daily swirl of constant change. Through intelligent discourse, inspired guests, and educational segments, I will help to enlighten your knowledge of astrology and guide you to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Call in with your questions and speak with some of the greatest visionaries in the time-tested practice of astrology. Turning of the Wheel, Astrology, Art, and Adventure with Chris Flisher, each week on Turning of the Wheel podcast. Hello and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Flisher. As you know, this is a show about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. And today we're going to be talking about a fascinating subject with one of the great outer planets coming in. Actually, it's a asteroid, but we're going to be talking about it with Rose Marcus from Canada. She'll be on in a few minutes here. Before we start, I want to go through a few things to remind you about my newsletter, which comes out every Sunday afternoon. In my newsletter, you'll find a couple of paragraphs about the mundane astrology of the planet we all are going through, and then I'll break it out into individual signs from there. You can subscribe to my newsletter from my website, chrisflisher.com or turningofthewheel.com, and I encourage you to do that. I get great results with that, and people seem to be very happy. So I've been following Rose for quite some time on the web and in other places, Facebook and stuff like that. And I was happy to have her on the show today, and I realized that she had just written a great piece about Chiron. So we're going to have her on today to discuss Chiron's ingress into Aries for the first time in about 50 years. So without further ado, let's get Rose on the line here. Rose, welcome to Turning of the Wheel. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, it's great. So I noticed your articles that you've been written, and there's a lot of chatter on the web about the ingress of Chiron into Aries, and let's just get some background, if you could, for the audience, just to get an idea of the momentous occasion of this and what it symbolizes.
Well, Chiron has just entered Aries. It did that on April 17. And for 2018, it will transit in the sign of Aries until September 25th. It's going to back into Pisces and cover the last few degrees of Pisces. And by February 18 of 2019, all the way through 2027, it will stay in the sign of Aries. So it's a long transit. And Chiron returns to its same position. The last time Chiron was in Aries was 1968 through 1977. Previous to that, it was 1918 through 1927. And just those last two transits, I'm sure, will immediately pique in the listener's mind the fact that those 1968 through 1978, 1918 through 1927 were standout decades. There was a lot happening. It was a very eventful timetable for the collective, and you might think back to if you're born in 1968 through 77, you're going to be having what we call a return, which means that Chiron's going to transit the same place that it was at the time of your birth.
Right.
And also, too, the 1918 through 1927, there are folks on the planet who are experiencing that, the second return, and exiting the planet, as Barbara Bush did on April 17, right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a big deal, and Chiron is generally, it's for astrologers. It is something that has piqued interest and been, it has impact in it, and the whole astrological community really grabbed Chiron as a feature planet, to our astrological deck. I think that the average general public now is hearing a lot about it. I mean, it's all over YouTube, and so although it is a relatively new planetary body discovered in 1977, it's something that I think has such strong magnetic resonance that we're all piqued by it. And why we're piqued by it is that it speaks to each one of us, right?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And you look back at those time frames, we see an enormous amount. I mean, of course, it's coincidental with other planetary bodies as well, but we see that that period of time, we see this enormous explosion of creativity and a whole turn, especially around 1968. This is a very powerful time. We had a great deal of civil and social unrest. We had a number of very big assassinations during that time. So this is a pretty powerful time that we're going to be seeing sort of cyclically represented in this time, I guess would be the right way to say it.
Yeah, it's maverick time, right? And
Maverick, yeah.
And it's warrior up time, as we say. Aries is the warrior archetype. So Aries is the first sign of the zodiac, and as such, it is the first sign of spring. So it starts the season. And as the first archetype, it is all about pioneering, initiating, beginning, starting. That's the Aries archetype. So absolutely, a lot of groundbreaking.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense too, especially because the symbolism of that new start gives us that sense of of a beginning, and it gives us a sense of. I think there can be a sense of optimism there, depending upon how we reflect this. But we also see events are folding on our newspaper headlines every day that certainly, support this whole concept at the same time. Because we do see a lot of these similar themes recurring, especially with the kinds of unrest that we're seeing on the world stage.
1,000%, 1,000%. And that's when we look back at the previous cycles, we can see some similarities. The 1918 through 1927 was just this huge emancipation explosion that was coming out of World War I, and that was the Roaring Twenties and the flapper years, and so on. And so, at that time, the suffragette movement had been going on for a long time, but during those years, women over 30 won the right to vote. When we came to 1968 through 1977, again we had women's lib, right?
Absolutely,
and,
very big idea. Yeah.
Yeah, and not only that, but sexual revolution as well too. In the 1918 through 1927, the flapper. Before that was the corsets, and you couldn't show your ankles because that was so risque. And here now we have the flappers with their flimsy dresses and their bare arms and their bare legs, and say that these were the women who cut their hair and smoked and drank and voted, right?
Right, exactly.
And then in the 1968 to 1977, not only women's lib, but there's gay rights and lesbian movement, and everything going on at the same time. And the 1968 through 1977 was also at the start of that. The whole explosion with the AIDS virus, right?
Right, exactly.
How frightening that was, right?
But it's an interesting point that you make, though, is the correlation between the flappers and the hippie generation, for lack of a better term, because that was also, they're both a sort of a revolution of sorts of the role of women and perhaps the role of gender within society as a greater concept, which we are also seeing now with the Me Too movement, which is really spot on.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So here we come again, and too with this sexual revolution, each time up, back in the 1918 through 1927 was a time frame when women were starting to demand more control over their bodies, right? And again in the 60s as well too, and here we are now, same thing. And we have also the whole sexual revolution in terms of gender assignment.
Yes,
transgenders
exactly.
are coming, the pansexuals, and so on now. Coming out into the moment, the right to exist. That is certainly an Aries archetype.
Yeah, I think the parallels are stunning. This is why astrology always amazes me, and I'm sure it does you as well. It just has when you see these recurring events. History doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but the themes are there, and it does have a sense of rhyme to it, as Mark Twain once said. History does not repeat itself, but it sure rhymes. And we're seeing the same thing. I think the sort of the resurgence of the Me Too movement right now is spot on. It's just incredibly accurate for what we're witnessing now. I just happened to read a story in the New York Times this morning about The NFL cheerleaders who were forced to do things against their will because they were being held by, and that's all coming out now. It's just being exposed. So this is really a chance to overturn the whole societal structure in this regard.
Absolutely, and what happened recently? Bill Cosby finally charged.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, huge, and Harvey Weinstein on the roster for next. Right,
and then everybody else that went down as well. There's a lot of major characters that went down and continue to go down.
Absolutely, absolutely. So each time Chiron comes round, it's kind of the next level up of all of that, and certainly, the Aries archetype is for emancipation. So this is exactly what is. We see this happening in so many different ways, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really it's stunning, and it's what I find interesting about it is that it's happening at a similar time as Uranus is going to be going into Taurus, where we have a similar time that you mentioned back. We look at the 84 years before Uranus was in Taurus. We see a sitting president of the United States, Herbert Hoover, was very much of an isolationist, very anti-immigration, and we're seeing that again. We saw the rise of Nazism and fascism in Europe. So there's a lot of parallels in line with this as well with regard to Uranus at the same time.
Absolutely, and when we talk astrology, when we talk signs, we talk planets, and Aries, Chiron in Aries brings up Mars, and Uranus in Taurus brings up Venus, and Venus and Mars are the relationship duo, right? So while both of these are going to town, it is about again an acceleration and breakthroughs in terms of the whole dynamic of relationships. And when I talk about relationships, I always say me to you, me to them, and me to us, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So it is at every level, personal relationships and social relationships and politics, and again the relationship to mankind, to the planet, right?
Right.
Everything. Absolutely.
Yeah, it is everything. We are in a relationship of one form or another to everything in the world. That is absolutely true. That's how we are. It's sort of the mirroring effect of how we gain a sense of self is by the relationship we enter into, whether with our boss or our wives or husbands or children or whoever the person may be, or even corporations and banks and all that. We are in a relationship with each of them. So it's a very vital point.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah. So when you look at so when you think of Chiron as an archetype, I always think of it as, of course, as the wounded healer. And so this would be a chance for this Me Too movement to sort of say, enough is enough. We're coming back, and this is the time for us to heal this very, very sore and sad wound that's been there forever, it seems like.
Absolutely. The wounded healer archetype, I also call Chiron the healing crises archetype.
Yeah.
So first it has to be exposed before it can be healed, right? So that's the piece of it. And you'll see this at all levels. Chiron was abandoned by both of his parents, and he's got this status as as a loner, and we get lots of archetypes out of that. But refugee is the one thing I wanted to bring up, because I was watching the news last night here in Canada, and back when the Syrian refugee crisis a couple of years ago was getting just really horrendous, with people dying that were trying to escape the country, and all that kind of stuff. And Canada said that we were going to take a massive amount of refugees into Canada, which is totally great. And of course, Trump was saying no way, and so forth. But last night on the news, they were also talking about how many people are crossing the border from the States into Canada that are looking for refugee status, and these are the Dreamers and the Haitians, and
right.
all of the people out of the U.S. that are fearing to be kicked out of the country, who have known, a lot of them know nothing else but America as home. And that number last night on the news, it said that was 46,000 that had happened quite recently. And that's on top of, as I said, the Syrian refugees that we brought into the country. I think all those issues are the displaced individual and the displaced lives. I think that also is a direct correlation to Chiron's archetype, and how are we going to deal with it, and how are we going to live in harmony on the planet? It's a big job right now, isn't it?
Yeah, it's forcing the conversation into the center of the room, whereby we can no longer ignore it. We have to acknowledge the fact that the world is in an enormous state of flux. in many ways unparalleled, just because by virtue of the fact that the world is that much larger, there are that much more people, and a lot of this was precipitated, I believe personally, by what we did in Iraq when the United States invaded Iraq back in 2002 or one, whatever it was, after when W. Bush was president, because by going into that area of the world, we forced people to refuge to other parts of the world, and it just kept on mushrooming as the violence and the destruction kept growing, and it forced this whole dynamic of this mushrooming cloud of immigration all over the place, and it's just a huge something we have to reconcile. But your point is very well taken about this is a global issue, and I think in many ways, if we looked at this from a 10,000-foot view, I would say this is sort of the universe saying to us, you've got to resolve this problem. Instead of acting with borders all the time, act as a planet more so than as a country. I think that's really underlying message there in some ways.
Absolutely. And globalization, this is the thing, is recognizing that there is no degree of separation between you and anything within creation, right?
Right.
So for us to be as one on the planet, certainly we are subjected, we all breathe the same air,
Mm-hmm.
So if China isn't going to do its part to clean up the planet, or if Canada isn't going to do its part to clean up the planet, it's affecting all of us. So
Right.
It is the ripple effect, right?
And unfortunately, I think Canada and China will take steps to resolve their pollution problems. It's us, the United States, that has decided to back out, which is really something that just galls me. But anyway, I always thought that when I was a younger kid, I always thought the only way we would ever resolve the border and the political problems between societies and cultures was that we would have to have a common problem. And I thought that if we had a common problem, we would all rise together as human beings, as a species, and band together to resolve their problems. And we're facing that in some ways with climate change and this enormous problem with the immigration. This is something that we cannot turn our heads away from. We sort of have to jump into and accept. And that in the crux of that matter, there may be some gem of bringing us all together to band together. Although it doesn't seem like that way right now, I could see that becoming an outcome at some point.
Well, I think that's a very valid point, Chris, and this is what I think is that when you are touched by tragedy,
Mm-hmm.
it certainly opens your heart.
It does.
I mean, it does. If I'm sitting here and I'm watching TV or watching things, I might not care so much. But when it's really, in my face, it's going to make me get up and do something, right? That's the whole thing. And I think you're absolutely right about that. A few years ago they were talking about, I don't know, the turning of the ages, collective enlightenment, and we're all going to, as I always say, sing the Coke song. You remember that?
Right. I do, yeah.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
And, that's not the way. How we are going to come together is, crises is the thing that accelerates evolution, gets us going faster, gets us on point a heck of a lot faster. You've got to scramble to, fix that, whatever it is.
You
heal
sure
that,
do. You have no
it is.
choice. You have to, it's the squares in the chart that force us to react. We have to have that hardship. If we didn't have the hardship, we would never respond. We would sit on the sofa and just take a nap. We wouldn't get anything done. So when the uncomfortableness comes, you should really, in some ways, welcome the uncomfortableness because it does force you to take action.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so
I always say that we're sloths,
Yeah.
our human nature, we're sloths, the universe shows up and says, hey, you want to do some work? And you go, well, nah, not really, and the next time the universe comes, with a little bit stronger push, you want to do the work now? Oh, well, I could, but, and finally when you get slammed with a 2x4, you're going to get up and and move out of the way.
You're going
right?
to move out of the way, absolutely. And I think that, and then when we look to find Chiron in our personal charts, we see the interaction of where it is where it is currently and the transiting. And then, of course, the squares and the trines to that will bring about those topics for us on a personal level as well as a global level.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And so the thing I think that I find with it is that when I look back in my own life, and you're very right about when you have experienced tragedy, that's when your heart really opens. When I look back in my own personal life, I can see the distinct impression that when Chiron was transiting my natal Chiron by degree, it was an incredibly difficult time for me on a number of different levels. But those challenges that I had to face at that time brought me to be a more open person, much more empathetic, and allowed me to appreciate what it is to go through hardship. You have to go. You cannot. I always say that you can't ask a man to imagine what it's like to be pregnant because we're never going to know. But you can ask a man to imagine what it's like to lose somebody close to them, or a woman to lose somebody close to them. And when they experience that universal heartbreak or pain, whatever it is, that enforces them to grow in some manner. And people have the ability to go either direction. They can either choose to allow that to expand them, or they can use that to pull back and become victims. And I think that's a critical matter that people face at that point. I always encourage them to say, step into it, just embrace it, and try to get as much as you can good out of it while you've got it. It's very key.
Yes, absolutely. I'll say that my Chiron return that happened a little while ago, same thing. It reopened the wound. It's Chiron is a chronic theme that can take place in your life. It might take place through different people and different circumstances and so on, but there's a similarity in whatever that theme is. Mm-hmm. And I do remember going through my Chiron return with, again, refestering the wound, but I was able to have consciousness that was really very observational. I was able to watch all of that going on. And I think for me, I felt like it was a very poignant journey. Painful, yes, but great learning. And in the end, it was all about how I could reconcile with myself. The situation might be futile. The situation might not result in something that you want to see in particular, but what you're learning out of it, and how that raises the consciousness and raises the awareness, raises the understanding, opens that up. I think is where the gift of the Chiron return is.
Yeah, it's very difficult to notice that gift when you're in the middle of it, I would say, though. I think it's just one of those things, as you say, it's very difficult and very painful, but you've got to be circumspect about it and say, this is here for a reason. And when you look back after you've been through that sort of tragedy or that travail, you can see that, yes, this, in many ways, this had to happen in order for us to be who we are as we evolve to it. And as you say, it's not a pleasant experience, but it is one that it does enlighten us ultimately.
Right, exactly. Exactly. So it's quite a journey.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that fascinates me the most about this subject is the sort of the historical relevance. Now, we can tie that to a lot of other planets as well, but in this particular case, it's pretty spot on when you stop to think about the themes that we see rising and the themes that you mentioned about the flappers and then the hippie generation, and now here we are with the Me Too generation. They all have a similar thread of evolutionary progress towards what ultimately, I hope, is a female leaders of the world, so that we can get to that place where men are no longer out there running around trying to, invade countries and take over dynasties and stuff like that. I think this is a strong shift towards that, and it's a great time for it to happen.
Absolutely. And, I'm an evolutionary astrologer, and so when I look at the chart, I'm looking through the looking to the soul.
Yeah.
The soul is Pluto, and so on, and what I feel about Chiron is that it's an emissary for the soul.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it's working with the outer planets. Of course, we can see, we can attribute some things to the other planets, but certainly Chiron is playing its part. And what I say about Chiron in the chart is that it is doing specific and key work. Wherever your Chiron position in your chart is, I call it's cellular memory. It's a specific memory pool of all of your peak experiences over your evolutionary journey. And so these will be, those peak experiences. They stay with you. They're on a ready recall. I mean, if you ever think about anything that is painful or frightening or so on, you've got the immediate emotions of that, right?
Right,
you're
mm-hmm.
You're right back there. Even joy, something that would be joyous, you can readily recall that. That's Chiron. And so Chiron has some specific work to do in terms of wherever it sits in your chart, to do some very, very specific, very pointed healing regarding your own personal journey.
And I think if the individual is objective and honest with themselves and they look at that position, they will begin to see the logic applied and it begins to stack up. I have it in my fourth house, for example, and I know exactly why I have it there. And it made perfect sense when you stack all the pieces together. It just fits perfectly there. And it's a very difficult placement for me, but yet it has also allowed me to grow and beyond. I don't think I could have gotten to where I am today had I not had that placement.
Right, exactly. You
Yeah.
know, and I'll say the same thing for myself. Chiron's my tightest T-square in my chart, and
I've got a T-square too for that too. Yeah, it's brutal.
Yeah, and it definitely has been something that I've had to make friends with.
Make friends with. That's a good way of looking at it too. I think because you have to accept we have to accept these difficult aspects in our charts. We cannot change them. We were born into a place and time with this as our character attributes, and so we have to accept them. And I think to try to run and hide from them in some ways doesn't do us any service. It sort of it prolongs the pain in some ways by running away, and by
Yeah, the only reason we're here is that we've reincarnated is to do our work.
Yeah, and so that's what it all comes down to, and it comes down to, and so I think that you can find ways to manifest that by going the opposite direction. If you're feeling pulled down by a certain aspect of where Chiron is in your chart, I think you have to sort of jump to the other extreme to sort of counterbalance that in some ways. Try to find the antidote or the necessary medicinal or therapeutic tool to resolve that problem.
Well, this is what I always say is that we talk about Chiron as as your greatest wound and the wounded healer and the healing crises and all that. But and you actually was good. You were talking about to begin with in this segment here about the great creativity and so on. I also see Chiron as your greatest resource because through all of the trials and tribulations that you go through with Chiron, the byproduct of that is extraordinary resource, and if you have the wherewithal to be able to look inside, you'll see that you have been able to develop something that is stronger than you perhaps give it credit for, is what I'll say.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think that we don't really recognize that, but I think if you did an in-depth study of anybody's chart and you began to start talking to Chiron and Chiron's role in the person's life, you would see that the connections would begin to fall into place. For example, if somebody started talking to me about my Chiron and they started saying, well, this is what I would say, of course, this is what it's all about. This is what I've lived all my life. It's very readily apparent. And I think that, it's the idea that we adopt new planetary bodies within our realm of knowledge is part of the evolutionary process in itself. I think that as we evolve and we discover new entities in the universe, they take on this new symbolism that is which is right for the times at which we discover them. And I love that sort of that immediacy of the concepts. Like when this was discovered, 1977. Well, we look back historically at what that meant, and we see all these parallels. It's just brilliant when it works like that.
Oh, absolutely. It's an awakening of consciousness, but something that we've always had within us.
Yeah, and I think that when you take the approach of Chiron as a place of pain, a room of pain in your house of houses, in your chart of houses, I think it's okay to reconcile that in some way. I think the best way to reconcile it is to be a creative embracer of that pain. I think that, as I mentioned earlier, to run from it is not the right thing. You have to sort of delve into it and find the root of it and find, the idea is that in nature, for example, if you go and you find a plant of poison ivy somewhere, right next to poison ivy is going to be the cure for poison ivy. This is part of the way the world is. Oftentimes, the antidote is right next to the source of the problem. So if we go and we look at Chiron as perhaps a source of pain in our lives, we could also say, maybe in that same area, or that house, or whatever you want to see it in your house, in your chart, maybe that's where you need to put your energy back into to resolve that problem, because it's so close to you. The only way to resolve it is to pour yourself in, and I think I've done that in my own personal life. I can see that very clearly.
Well, again, Chiron was, among his many attributes, the father of homeopathy.
Oh,
And that's
interesting.
exactly what you're describing. It is a bit of the poison contains the cure, right?
Exactly, and it's spot on in my case. I mean, if mine was, I've gone out of my way. I've got a moon in Cancer, so I've gone out of my way to make my home and family a very important piece of who I am and my identity, and to make it a warm, loving place. Largely because, in some ways, because of the fact that I have Chiron in my fourth house. So this is a way of perhaps rewriting the story of what Chiron was in the past in a new way, through a new set of lenses, which I think is actually pretty, that's the idea. Like you say, homeopathy. It's the cure is right there, right where you think the pain is, the cure is as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We're talking today with Rose Marcus. Her website is rosemarcus.com. It's ROSEMARCUS. She's up in Canada, and has written a series of articles, and great articles about Chiron, and Chiron has just stepped into Aries. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back in about 2.5 minutes, so hang in there. In the meantime, check out her website. She'll be going to the United Astrology Conference in Chicago at the end of the month. I hope to run into her there. I'm sure I will. And she also has a lot of great resources. I encourage you to sign up for a newsletter as well. You're signing up for mine, of course, at the same time. But anyway, we'll be back. We'll be back in about 2 minutes, and we'll pick up our conversation.
What is your destiny? Where are you going? What is your real purpose? Do you know? Do you want to know? Of course you do. It's your duty to yourself. We are all here for a reason, and we all have great potential. Discover all of this and more with a professional astrology reading. My name is Chris Flisher, and I can help you. Discover your strengths and work on your weaknesses, and live your life to its fullest capacity. Based on your birthday, birthplace, and birth time, an authentic astrology reading will allow you to live your life to the fullest and reveal your true purpose. Only real astrology can give you real information. It is your destiny, and it is your path. Write me at chris@chrisflisher.com and book a reading today, or call me at 978-393-1036. That's 978-393-1036. www.chrisflisher.com.
Astrology is the science of spirit, and it can serve as an invaluable aid in making the difficult choices in life and seeking truth in all the directions we choose. It holds the potential to allow each of us to evolve to our highest potential. It is the logic of the universe, the code of existence, and the pathway to true wisdom. It is our duty to draw from it the instructions for our lives and to live them to our fullest potential. As the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed.
Hi, your host, Chris Flisher here. I've been producer and host of this podcast and radio show for the past 10 years. My goal has always been to provide enlightening, progressive, and logical discussions about where we are as a species and how we move ourselves further down the road towards our greater potential. I believe astrology provides a great tool for observing our progress and awakening our consciousness to becoming a whole, better, and more complete individuals. I have sought to invite the best contemporary guests, thought leaders, and progressive minds to discuss topics that concern us all, regardless of your beliefs. Consider making a contribution through PayPal to help keep the great wheel turning so that I can continue for the next 10 years along the same enlightened path. As always, I thank you for your support.
Okay, welcome back to Turning the Wheel. We're speaking today with Rose Marcus. She's an astrologer out of Canada. Her website is rosemarcus.com, and we're talking about Chiron and Aries. And you mentioned before the break, Chiron was the lord of homeopathy. I'm curious what your take on that is, and your story behind that.
Well, I was just saying, contained within in the poison is also the antidote or the cure.
Right.
But I was, and we talked about that before break. But I was just going to reiterate. A couple of years ago, I was gardening, and I almost amputated a finger.
Oh my gosh! Wow.
Which was a really horrible thing to happen. And so, of course, in my healing, I was at the therapist, and she was saying, "Oh, I just saw you walk in the room, and you've been walking in the room separating that finger." And she said, "You have to bring it back in. It has to work with the rest of them." And I was just thinking about how we do that when we have a wound, is how we take it out, we separate it, and it becomes, an entity unto itself. And part of that Chiron process is to, and especially with Chiron and Aries, is to create a larger degree of separation from it, so that you can then observe it from a different angle. And we were talking about this a little earlier in the program, outpicturing. It is through that observation here. Take a step back so that you can take a look at it, so that you can then reintegrate it. Like I was with my finger there, she said, if you don't use it, it has to, and she told me to take my other hand and to practice, with both fingers, feeling things so that I could retrain the memories, the nerves in my fingers, so that I could get that working again. And I just thought that was such a Chiron process, the whole thing about paying attention to it. When we have a wound, it gets that special attention. We concentrate on it, whether that is a physical wounding or an emotional wounding or a material, or whatever it is, and we keep concentrating on it. And we need to take a step back to be able to have that better perspective, so that we can further integrate it. And that's the thing with Chiron. In terms of wounding, and I always say this like an emotional thing, the loss of somebody, or, the ending of a relationship is pretty brutal, or what have you. You never get to the end of the road with that, in terms of your heart being satisfied or,
that's true.
Resolved with that.
Yeah, you never really
and
resolve it.
Chiron's not about that. Chiron's about integrating. It's about taking that whole experience and integrating it, weaving it in, so that it becomes part of the psychic fabric, so it becomes part of woven into the soul, and it becomes one of the resources that you can then use to build further.
Yeah.
And again, like I say, when we see what's going on in the world, I think we have to get to a saturation point. We have to get to this place of where we go, enough is enough, like the Me Too movement or anything out there. It can't keep going this way, because it isn't serving. And there's a certain amount of that. It has to get to a saturation point before the energy charge of that can change.
Yeah, I totally get that. It makes complete sense. And I think that's the value of, that is illustrative of the whole idea of this concept of, facing the challenge, taking this deep dive, walking towards that which is unpleasant rather than away from it. I think we have to do that. And astrology is a great vehicle for that, because it really gets right to the point very quickly. You could spend months in therapy trying to resolve these problems of whatever where the pain is in your life, and never really come to terms with it. But I think astrology gets you there incredibly quickly, because it says, well, here's where the pain is in your life. How do you resolve that? How do you come to terms with this? You've got to walk into it. It's that challenge, as you say. Without one of the phrases I always say is, if the roof did not leak, we would not fix it. So the roof is leaking in our lives, or in our collective lives, or in our individual lives. When it leaks, we have no choice but to repair it. So it is a major wake-up call that has to make it. We've got to address.
Absolutely. Absolutely, 1,000%.
Yeah. It's, when we think about it, of course, there's other planets, as I mentioned earlier, that are involved in this. We're going through a very, very unusual time, and very sort of fractious time, I guess is a good word for it. It's very disturbing. We see a lot of, and it's everything we are seeing in the astrology of the world today is panning out exactly as we could envision it on the world stage. When we look at the headlines, we're seeing all of this, this historical shifts back to a time and place when we never thought we'd go back to this place. We've got people running the show we never thought we'd see running the show. And it's almost at a point where it's absurd. But if it wasn't this disturbing, we would not respond. Now, because it is this disturbing, because it is this outlandish, because it is this obscene in some cases, we've got to respond.
Absolutely, 1,000%. Yeah. And and Aries is about the here and now. And as we move through Chiron and Aries, and we've just come out of Uranus in Aries, so there's some similarity between the two transits. Crossing new Aries ground is not going to be that much unfamiliar, but as I said with Chiron earlier, I find I consider it to be very specific. But we are breaking new ground, and the one thing is that Aries. Aries is, in terms of evolutionary astrology, we call it the cutting edge of soul desires. And those cutting edge, Aries is instinctual, it's spontaneous, and it can be primal. And what will happen during the time that Chiron is moving through Aries, for wherever it might be in your chart, it is going to create a degree of separation between what has come before. And in that, what I'm finding with a lot of clients right now are saying, I don't know what's coming for me next. I don't know where I'm going to. I don't know what decision I should be making.
Mm-hmm.
And that's quite true. With Aries is about figuring it out in the moment. It's about managing the energy from the present. But I will say that we do know where we have been and don't want to be.
Right.
So we know the negatives. We know what didn't work. We know where we felt stifled or limited or restricted or what have you. And so to not worry about the great unknown that is in front of you, but to recognize that Aries is experiential and is experimental. So in terms of experience and experimenting, that is going to be informing. That is going to give you the next step. And the other thing with Chiron in Aries is that moves through because it is an impulsive, instinctual archetype. You can anticipate that you are going to be downloading some new instincts, that you are going to be coming up with some new impulses for yourself. And I say wait until those new instincts and those new impulses show up and then take the ball and run with it.
Right. But of course, as you mentioned, being an Aries, there's a sense of impulsivity about it and a sense of impatience about it. I think that we have to address that as well. And this is a time to perhaps to, as you say, wait for the answer to arrive. I've often found in my life when I'm trying to, when I'm wrestling with some sort of decision, I can't seem to get somewhere. I have many of the same, issues you're talking about. Where am I going next? We all have these problems. I think lately we're in a state of flux right now. This is a very powerful global kind of theme that we're experiencing. And I think we have to take the time to not act too quickly, because there is a tendency to fly off the handle. And oftentimes if we fly off the handle, we will find ourselves further back than we are when we want to be. So it is a good time to sort of process this slowly, see what happens, and not act impulsively. We all have bad days. We all have days where we think, gosh, what am I doing? Why can't I get where I want to get? And then you wake up the next morning, then all of a sudden you have a light bulb goes off and you see exactly where you want to go. I think that patience, that pause, it's almost like that putting the pause button on the old, like the old-fashioned tape recorder, hitting the pause button before you go further allows us to reflect that. And I think probably would be happier if we did that more often, more frequently.
Well, I think so too. And being an Aries,
I am too. I am an Aries too.
So I know the Aries energy very well.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say impulsiveness out of Aries that is willful tends to be incorrect. Impulsiveness that comes out of inspiration is definitely worth getting on the horse and riding.
Yeah, no, I think that inspiration piece. I think as you said, it's funny. I'm an Aries as well. The impulsivity of it all is where it really comes down, because as you mentioned, that if we take the time to just hold back on that, I think that what we will come to light will be far more beneficial.
Oh, absolutely. I've learned how to do that. I don't know about you, Chris, but it's taken me so long. Mm-hmm. But I've now come to the wisdom of counting to 10 first.
Yeah. Well, I tell you this much. I am much more patient than I was as a child. And I remember having, and it's interesting because I remember having a conversation once with Robert Hand, and I said, can we change our charts? As people often come to me and say, I don't like my chart. My clients say, I don't like my chart. And I always say, well, you can't do much about it. And I asked him the same question, just sort of a rhetorical question. I says, can we change our charts? He said, no, you can't change your chart, but you can redirect it. And I think that's what I've learned over the years. Through experiences and circumstances, I have learned to monitor that impatience, that impulsivity, and redirect it in a way that's more beneficial to me. The impulse and the attribute is always going to be there. It's still there. But how it's directed, which way it's pointed, which way it's aimed, is much different than it was when I was younger. I think that's what I would say about that.
Yes, I totally agree with that.
Yeah, yeah.
Redirect. That's the brilliant Rob Hand.
Brilliant, Rob Hand. Yeah, it's just a sort of a way, because the energy, I think we all have the potential, and the potential is always there, but potential can go either way, as with anything, just like magnetics, the potential can go negative or positive. But in that crux, in that vibrating vortex of the plus and the minus, one of us may react in one way, but the potential for the opposite is always there. There's always this pairing. This is the great duality of life, where we have this pairing of opposites that if we try one thing, the answer might be in just the opposite. And I think that's kind of interesting.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And sometimes it's not about perfection, too, and making that correct decision that gets you the pot of gold there. We do make mistakes, and we do self-inflict, which is one of Chiron and Aries' wounded issues here, and so forth. But it's all a learning curve. Sometimes we learn best through our mistakes, right? Skin those knees, get up and go again, right?
Yeah, it's those damn squares that get us every time. I always use the analogy of the square being like a step, like you're climbing the stairs in your house. It's a 90-degree angle on all those steps, and those are just exactly that's a metaphor for what it's like to face your challenges. Climbing stairs can be hard, but when you get to the top, you're happy, or you got into your destination at least. But during getting there, you have to climb these steps, which are equivalent to the squares in the chart.
Absolutely, I agree with that.
So when we look at this coming up, I mean, when we see the historical relevance of where we've been in a number of instances and where we're going, and we see the influence of this presence coming to light, we can really see a dynamic shift occurring that's really gathering quite a groundswell, which I think you and I probably, years ago would have seen this coming because we are astrologers. We would have seen this sort of the shift towards the more of the feminine, divine feminine quality. I think that's very relevant now. And I think that the fact that so much is coming to light with regard to this subject it's absolutely perfect timing. And this is how we evolve. We've got to evolve through this. We've got to come to a point in time where we address this. And, I noticed this years ago. I stayed home with my children back in 1986, which was really unheard of back then. I was one of the first house husbands on the block. And I was out there with my kids at the playground, and I was the only guy out there with these babies. And it was remarkable. I said, this is where we have to go. We've got to reverse our roles here so that we have a sense of what it means that we can't be this sort of one-sided species where all things are done one way and not the other. We have to have this be more flexible, be more adaptive. We're more resilient as individuals when we know the whole story, both sides of the story, I think.
Well, absolutely. And as I said earlier, Mars and Venus are being intensified through the transits of Uranus and Chiron in these lengthy cycles. And I have to say, being a woman and an Aries, that I'm just absolutely appalled because I would think we'd be there by now.
Oh, I did too. I thought for sure. That's the impatient Aries in me as well. I thought we'd be there. I thought we'd be there in 1974, 75. I thought for sure we'd already be there.
Absolutely. And, Chiron was discovered in the sign of Taurus, which, again, is just another indicator of the return of the sacred goddess. And this is exactly so. It is for the warrior goddess and the warrior gods to come and join together now, I think.
Yeah, but that slow one step forward, two steps back, one step forward is very much like a retrograde cycle of any planet. We sort of have this great thrust, as you and I said. We both thought we would have been there a long time ago, but yet we had to go into sort of a classic, social and cultural and political retrograde, bringing us back to a time. Then we go forward. We went backwards with the Bush years, then we go forward with the Obama years, and now we're going backwards again, and then probably the next one will be forward, hopefully, knock on wood. And so we have that sort of back and forth thing. I think it's very much like a retrograde cycle in that regard.
Absolutely. We are heading in. We're just at the start. We had 2012 to 2016 with the Pluto-Uranus squares going on, and that was busting up the concrete there. We have Pluto in Capricorn from 2008, busting up the concrete there. Yeah. And now we're heading into the next cycle of Uranus in Taurus and Chiron in Aries. We have chosen, all of us, to be here now. And we've chosen that because we have recognized that we have a lot of growth and a lot to contribute as well too to to the collective right here and right now.
Yeah, we have a lot to contribute, and we will be forced to reconcile that due to the circumstances that are about on our footsteps, our doorsteps, rather. When you look at the historical precedents that were set and the historical setting of the stage that happened, when Chiron was here, say 50 years ago, or even Uranus, 84 years ago, it can be very disturbing, and yet we see this coming to fruition. I was always of the opinion that once we've been through something as bad as World War I or World War II, we'd never let it happen again. And I do believe that's probably true, although we could be stepping into very similar grounds right now. And that's the thing is that we have evolved further. We are more conscious, I think, as a species. We're more conscious of the perils of war, and more apprised of that. But there's some of these circumstances are just out of our beyond our reach and out of our control. But I do think that having the vibration level be shifted upward has helped, at least in some capacity, because people are far more aware than they ever were.
Absolutely, and there's three different levels that that we are dealing with, and one is the manifest realm or the consensus realm, right? And as we see, we've got all this breakdown happening. In the ingress chart for Chiron, Chiron is in Aries. It is, and for this transit for 2018. Chiron is maintaining a square to planet Saturn, right. And it is just very close. Right now we have May 15 when Uranus will leave Aries for Taurus. Right. So we have Uranus finishing Aries and Chiron just entering Aries. And the two of them, with Chiron moving slower than Uranus, we have a seeding going on between Chiron and Uranus. When Chiron is in the sign of Aries, it is moving out towards the orbit of Uranus, and it is moving away from the orbit of Saturn. Saturn deals with our manifest, our consensus, our reality, our borders, our governing, our the way we live in an organized whole. And as Chiron is moving away from there, it is. It is impacting all of that reality base for us. But as it moves towards Aquarius is really the archetype of individuation and independence. All of those kinds of freedom initiatives. Uranus is about the zeitgeist of the moment, and about our cultural and our social and so on. I think that we are now moving to the place where we are more geared towards individuation and more independent action. It gives us the opportunity now to consider alternatives, to break out of the mold instead of saying, well, this isn't working for me, but I've got to keep supporting the system, is now to say, no, well, maybe I'll try entrepreneur, or maybe I'll try an alternate lifestyle now, because what have I got to lose? If the reality that is considered the norm, or what is, the standards for all of us, is not fitting the bill, then let me try something new. And so I think that picking up the flavor of Aquarius, which is about reinventing the wheel, Chiron is moving out towards the orbit of Uranus, and I think that we will now, especially with Aries, it's all about courage, right? Courage, initiative. I think we will find that just like the Me Too movement is, finally now, somebody's got to have some courage to stand up there and represent. And I think that we will all feel that more as this transit goes further along, that you're going to be saying, well, why not give it a try?
Right, especially when you see those who've gone first, the pioneers who have blazed these trails and come out and made their claims. There is a certain sense of unification that goes with that. It's a sense of sort of brothers in arms, or sort of solidarity with those who've gone out, and it gives you that courage to address the same thing. And people who may have been meek or shy or reluctant to come forward in the past, perhaps now are more inclined to do so.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we're really at a real crossroads here with regard to where we are. And like yourself, I am very impatient about this, or at least surprised that it's taken this long. But I think that if things had not become so absurd as they are now, the fact that we have Donald Trump in office right now, to me, is a complete absurdity of the highest order. And yet, because it's so absurd, people are coming out in droves to sign up to run for office that never would have run before. And people are registering to vote because they want to get rid of this evil specter. And so that in itself has that silver lining to that cloud. I mean, it's a big cloud. I won't deny that. But the silver lining is the fact that it's also is a call for action to respond to that.
Absolutely. I say with Chiron, look for the byproducts.
Yeah.
Those are where the jewels are. For sure. I was going to say in terms of the other cycles as well, too. Back in 1918 through 1927, just coming out of World War I, it was the advance of aviation. And by the end of Chiron and Aries, commercial flights were happening, right? So man could fly, right?
Right.
In 1968, 69, we put a man on the moon.
A man on the moon. There you go. Exactly.
And on the day that the ingress happened on April 17, NASA announced that they were heading out into the cosmos, looking for exoplanets, life on other planets. And I just think that that's so symbolic.
It's key. It's spot on, because they're just all about that same sort of pioneering exploration, which is typical Aries all the way. Go charging in where when other men would never go, you go charging in. It's that same sort of quality. And it is interesting. And of course, by the same token, we're looking at, what's his name? I forgot his name right now. Anyway, Elon Musk is looking at trying to get a spaceship onto Mars and planning on travel to Mars. So this is another whole, awakening thrust into a whole new area of, expansion of the part of the universe, which is just, it's again, very supportive of where we are with regard to the astrology.
Oh, absolutely. And did you know that Gene Roddenberry, who
the Star Trek,
and his, to go where no man has gone before.
Right.
It's such a Chiron and Aries statement.
Yeah, and here we are. And so, so for all the, I don't want to end on a negative note here, but I want to end on a positive note, but for all of the angst that we live through and all the frustration and the anger and the sort of the pulling our hair when we see these news headlines and we read these tawdry stories about this stuff. For all of that we have to endure, we've also got to say that without that happening, we would not be able to get to the other side, which is just the opposite. So we have to have this sort of, it's like a gigantic pendulum. We've got to go from one extreme. Once the pendulum gets the other one direction, it swings back and we begin to see the action again. This is just a universal, constant, it seems like.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. One extreme to the other, somewhere will eventually come to the middle.
Or not. We don't know that. I mean, given history,
or not.
given history and all that, maybe we won't. But I think that we will reach a point where we are at least perhaps more apprised of what we're doing, where we are, and also we will have learned, hopefully, we have made progress. We have to admit, we've made progress in many ways. We wouldn't be talking about this Me Too movement today. We wouldn't have talked about this back in 1918. It would be unheard of. So we are making progress. It's just not as fast as perhaps you or I, being Aries, want to see. That's probably our topic, not the world's topic. It's not our.
You may be right there.
Yeah.
Well, I like when we started. You were talking about the great creativity as well too, and that's what I like to look at as well too. I mean, these years are going to reinvent and introduce so many things that we have no idea what's coming for us next, and it could be brilliant. So it's great to hold to that. The creative opportunity in the here and now is exceptional.
Yeah. Well, creativity comes from crisis. And when we have crisis, that's when we're going to see the greatest burgeoning of creativity that's going to come forth. It's always been the case. If you look back through all of history, wherever times were the toughest, that's when the most phenomenal people rose. That's what brought birth to the Beatles. I mean, they were unheard of beforehand, and they created a huge whole world unto themselves, which was optimistic and positive, and sent us all in a different direction completely. So you're right. That kind of person may be out there. There's somebody out there lurking in the who has not risen yet or has stepped onto the stage yet, who may deliver something equally as phenomenal as all that we've seen in the past. I think that's very appropriate.
Yes, you bet. Yes, you bet.
Yeah. So we've been talking today with Rose Marcus. She is an astrologer out of Canada. Her website is rosemarcus.com. Does a great newsletter every week, which I encourage you to sign up for after you sign up for mine, of course. And but anyway, and you're going to be talking at UAC, which is the United Astrology Conference in Chicago, the end of May. And are you talking about this topic? You are, right?
I am talking on Chiron, so yes, I have more.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, when you think about it, if you had to summarize sort of your overarching views on this right now as we go into this, what is your takeaway? Is this one of a time of great promise? Is this a time of, what's your ultimate, sort of your wrap up on that?
Well, if I were going to put a wrap up on it, this is what I'll say is that when Chiron is the greatest wound, there's this idea of not being able to do for yourself, but to do for others. And what I say is that when you are struggling with Chiron, if you can't create, serve, and if you can't serve, create, and that will open the doorway for you. It is a time frame now when courage isn't an option; it's a must. And so, trailblaze for yourself, break new ground, entertain a different way of being, and look for your opportunities.
And there's great salvation and redemption in giving. There's no question about it. I know that when I went through my own personal tragedies years ago, what made me feel the best was going out and giving to others, and it just was a wonderful sense of. It gave you a sense of purpose, against a sense of reasoning, a sense of raison d'etre. It gave us all those things, a reason to be, and it's just the best thing to do, and it is what will enliven you. So use this in negative. We have some negative energy in the world today, but use it to point yourself in a better direction by giving outwardly as opposed to taking in, as Rose said. So that's very apt, very appropriate, and very good wisdom to hear. Anyway, we've come to the end of our hour, unfortunately, and I want to thank you for coming on today, Rose. It's been great having you on. We had a great conversation for two Aries. It's pretty hard to contain us, but we did okay. rosemarcus.com is her website. I encourage you to go there. And I will see you at UAC, Rose. I'm going to look you up, so I will see you there.
I'll look forward to it. Thank you, Chris.
You're welcome.
You've been listening to Turning of the Wheel with your host, Chris Flisher. To schedule a reading with me or to order artwork, you may visit my website at www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. Or you can call me at 978-393-1036. Thank you. And as always, be open to possibilities.